Hello, everyone. Welcome to my Eyes on Eurasia podcast. Today, we're joined by a guest who sits at the very edge of NATO security in the Baltic, Mr. Kaupo Rosin, who is the Director General of the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service, is joining us today. We're very happy that he's able to sit with us and talk to us from Tallinn. Director General Rosin is going to help us discuss a very critical document that they recently released by the EFIS in 2026, their annual report entitled International Security in Estonia 2026. If you haven't read it yet, or the previous report published in 2025, I strongly encourage you to read it. I have a copy of the 2025 report, so I very much enjoyed it, and the 2026 is packed full of information. So I always enjoy reading the reports. I actually got a copy last year when I was visiting Estonia in May, and so I actually went on a field trip up to Narva. But I'll be sure to include a copy of the report, and we'll have a link to that on my Substack. And it's a no nonsense report. Director General Rosin, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. And before we dive into the 2026 assessment, I wanted to kind of ask you a question, but first I just want to describe your background. You have served for 27 years in the Estonian Defense Forces. Your last posting before your current position as Director General was you were served as Commander of Cyber Command in Estonia. And from 2018 to 2022, you served as Deputy Director of the Analysis Unit of the Joint Intelligence Security Division at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Another aspect about your background I thought was really interesting is that you served in the multinational forces in Iraq in 2005. So you served in Iraq veteran, and thank you very much for your helping the United States during that very difficult time. But most importantly, I think is very interesting also in your background is you have an MBA in economics. So I think that kind of explains why you have this public relations dimension to you that I very much enjoy and are grateful for. So Director Rosin, just kind of in the last 48 hours, the Russians are up to a little bit of mischief again. The Russian bloggers have declared something called the Narva People's Republic. What is it exactly the Russians are up to? What happened right now with this that caused them to suddenly kind of to be active on this topic?
Yeah, good afternoon, Glenn. It's a pleasure to have this discussion with you. So, coming to your first question, well, what we have seen is that this is actually basic noise, let's say, prepared and put online by some activists. It seems that the Russian government is not behind this activity. And I also noticed that our own media in Estonia, let's say, played it a little bit bigger than it actually is. So if you look at the account, the numbers, the follower numbers and so on is very low. So we don't take it too seriously. It doesn't mean that we don't have to pay attention to these types of activities, of course, but this current, push is nothing we take too seriously at the moment.
Well, the timing is everything with the Russians. So I just had to ask that question because of the previous Russian repetition of the Donetsk People's Republic and all these other republics that they're so good at creating artificially out of nowhere. And I certainly, having visited Narva last year, I very much appreciated that. In fact, the checkpoint there, which I liken to Checkpoint Charlie, reminds me of very much kind of what I went through in the Cold War. And so it's a very much Narva's a flashpoint in the West, but Estonia's got good control of it. So let me dive into the current situation before we address what's in your report. The current situation in the Gulf conflict now with the American war against Iran. This war has now gone into the third week, but obviously there's some lessons here for the Baltic states. And one of the things that I'm curious about, as you witness with the Ukraine, is that Ukraine has really stepped forward with its experience in dealing with Shahed drones and has offered its expertise to the Gulf states. And we've kind of fallen into this discussion about whether Patriot missiles are sufficient enough to be able to intercept. It's one of the lessons of the Ukraine war is that it's given birth to the creation of what they call interceptor drones. And I'm just curious as to what your perspective is, given Estonia's proximity to Russia and the role that Iranian Shahed drones have played in this. What kind of lessons is Estonia taking away? And I understand you don't have to give me a definitive opinion, but many people here talk about the need to kill the archer, and that launching of these types of weapons and sitting back and taking punishment is something that you just can't do in this age. But there's also the expensive side of the Patriots and the cost expenditures versus the Shaheeds. Now, I've been to Amari Air Base. I know you're protected by NATO air power in the Baltic, but it's still an issue. So what is your perspectives on that?
Well, let's say the current situation in the Middle East is for us another confirmation of the importance of the unmanned systems. And of course, we have to take a look at it from both sides. So first, of course, how we can defend against such weapons, but also how can we use such weapons ourselves. And there are several layers here, of course. You mentioned if we start with the defense, obviously the high-tech weapons, Patriot, Iris-T and SAM-T, for example, are probably too expensive and also too limited in the terms of ammunition available to fight such low-tech, low-cost attack weapons. So also in Estonia, in our defense industry, we have understood that the key in the current warfare is the affordable mass, both for defense and offense, and any solutions which offer the defender side the possibility to combat such attack weapons in a low-cost method are very much appreciated. Well, let's see how it goes. But the unmanned systems field is overall becoming more and more important. The Russians learned some of it from the Iranians back then. Currently, the Russians are able to produce most of it themselves, and I think there are two militaries in the world who can use such weapons in all echelons and in all different services in a very effective way, and these are Ukraine and Russia. If you look at the Russian plans for the future, we can see that let's say the topic of autonomous systems or unmanned systems is developing. We will see in the Russian military in different branches, Army, Navy, Air Force, in all of them, an increased amount of specialized units regarding unmanned systems. And we also see already that in the Russian military, let's say, different unmanned units are also present in different echelons. If you talk about land forces, for example, so starting with the tactical FPVs, but then up to the strategic operational one-way attack drones. Something we have not yet seen too much from the Russian side are unmanned seaborne systems, which Russians put a lot of effort to develop. We see that the Russians have the technical in the talent capability, financial capability, and innovation capability to develop such systems. And they can, of course, test any solutions in the battlefield in a very rapid way. And of course, the problematic moment for us is that, let's say, the unmanned systems development and production, most of it happens outside of the traditional Russian military industrial complex, which then gives these companies the flexibility. So the traditional military industrial complex is, let's say, under very heavy bureaucratic load. There is a lot of corruption, but again, the unmanned systems are not part of this yet, at least. So, and in this regard, it's not only technology what we have to think of. It's also the doctrine side, the current battlefield behavior. How do you operate under such conditions? Can you maneuver? How you organize your logistics? And all these questions are actually currently very acute, also in the Estonian defense forces.
Well, that's where I want to ask you about this role of the new Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belosov, who you're tracking, and his role has been very critical in development of Russian unmanned forces, the development of Rubicon. And I kind of want what has been his impact? Do you attribute that a lot to his influence?
Well, it seems that a lot of it is bottom up because of the current battlefield realities. But what we can see is that let's say, some levels of Russian leadership have understood the importance and the effectiveness of such weapons. And yes, indeed, we will see the spreading of the unmanned system in the Russian military in the coming years, probably in a very broad scope, actually.
And you're certainly seeing that in the recruitment patterns of young Russians that are in the schools now, and also unmanned forces, which your report talked about was the growth of Russian unmanned forces. And
Absolutely.
is that go ahead?
Yes, and what we can see also is that in the education facilities in the schools, already young children are taught how to build cheap drones, how to operate them. It's for the next generation. It's obviously it's it's like a game for them. The children like this type of tools, so to say, and honestly, we are doing something similar in Estonia, also in our schools already, actually.
Well, that's one of the things that I completely agree with you that the whole lessons of the war, of the Ukraine war, are being learned by everybody. Even the Russians are mimicking the Ukrainians with what they're doing, and certainly now with the development of fiber optic drones, which is what I wanted to ask you about, because your report focused a lot on the industrial production and capabilities of Russia and their increases in ammunition production. But one of the things is this development of fiber optic drones, and that's the Ukrainians struck one of their only fiber optic plants, and now the Russians have turned to the Chinese, and it's increasing huge amounts of volume of fiber optics. So you're also watching this development as well?
Well, absolutely. We are trying to understand how the Russian industrial or military industry operates, where do they get their resources, what supply chain they use, and through this type of information, of course, one of the let's say outputs from our side is recommendations regarding the sanction regime. What companies should we target, and how to delay or intercept these types of deliveries to Russia.
Do you think that the Chinese are doing this? There's a policy that they have in place, or the Russians are exploiting it through commercial companies, and they're just turning their heads and looking the other direction. I mean, how much of this is kind of really developed by the Chinese government, you think?
Well, what we can definitely say is that nothing in China happens without the knowledge of the government. And if the Chinese government would like to stop this, they could do it effectively. So there is a minimum, let's say, from the Chinese government is ignoring this issue, which is also a decision then made by somebody. So there is at least that in place in China, I think.
Do you think it's kind of like a lever, like they're kind of regulating it, opening and closing it, widening it, for example, like with the fiber optics? The Russians lost the plant. It was hit by the Ukrainians in a drone attack, and then the Russians turned to the Chinese and said, "We need more of the fiber optics," and the Chinese said, "Okay," and the companies just expanded the production levels. That's got to be kind of what you're indicating, is that they're turning a blind eye to this because of the Russian requirement. Is that?
At least turning a blind eye, if not actively supporting or directing, which well, we don't have too much info about. But again, it's at least allowing it to happen, and that must be already a decision made by the government.
I agree, and I think that leads me to the next question, because your 2026 report uh, talks about the plateau of Russian ammunition production, how they've been able to regenerate their ability to produce ammunition, but I wanted to ask you about that. In the report, it mentions that, but it didn't mention North Korea and the Russians. And Shoigu himself he developed this policy of turning to North Korea. But your report didn't go into kind of the North Korean side of this alliance, of this relationship. And so I'm wondering how much of North Korea was it? Do you think its role will continue in that way, or it filled the temporary bottleneck the Russians had, and then it kind of played its role, and then they don't still need it? Is that what your report was kind of indicating?
Well, as far we understand, is that the North Korean government is ready to support Russians in any way if Russians need it. And it's ammunition, it's manpower, and I'm confident that the North Korean government is ready to continue the deliveries if the Russian side requests so. North Korean ammunition over the last years has helped the Russians in a big way to continue the war against Ukraine. The numbers what the North Koreans delivered are in millions, which is a significant amount. And of course, the question we should ask is, what does North Korea get in return for these deliveries? What type of technology are the Russians offering, or how they support the North Koreans, and that will have an impact in the Asia or Indo-Pacific region in the future.
So it's further indication that the Indo-Pacific and the role of North Korea is playing a role in a ground war in Ukraine. I mean, it's a big. You can't isolate North Korea from the Pacific and from Europe. This is when I think the key lesson here. And do you think that the Russians have improved the quality control of the ammunition? Have they sent advisors and tried to get North Korea to improve the quality? Has there been any improvement in the quality of what they're producing in ammunition and shells?
Well, yeah, we don't know that really in detail. Well, what we have seen in the battlefield is that indeed North Korean ammunition used so far, at least, has had different quality problems. There has been some percentage of the ammunition which doesn't work or doesn't fly where it's needed to be. But again, I'm not able to answer how the Russians will, or if the Russians will support the future North Korean ammo production.
Have you, with close to 10,000 North Koreans showing up in Kursk, I mean, have you ever woken up one morning and wondered if the North Koreans might someday show up at Narva? Has that even crossed your mind at all?
Well, what we have seen is that the world is, getting smaller and smaller. And if there would be a Russia-NATO conflict one day, well, who knows who would show up on the Russian side? It's possibly North Koreans. They have a agreement. But again, in the Russian forces in Ukraine, we have seen, let's say, different, let's say, recruits from different African countries also. So the Russians are, recruiting or trying to wrap in different countries, different people, in order to deal with their own manning issues.
Well, let me explore that a little bit more. That's a really interesting. I want to ask you about that. It's a very interesting observation, because the Russian manpower in the war in Ukraine has kind of gone through different phases. So you had this phase where Prigozhin was emptying the prisons, trying to replace units in recruitment there. Then you had this other thing where they exhausted a lot of the prisoners. Then they started this recruitment effort in Africa. And in reality, it's not the Africans and other third world recruits are not that large, it's significant. But is there some type of um, mathematic calculation that the Russians use with manpower that they see, well, we want to get 10,000 recruits from Nepal and we want to get 10,000 from Africa? Is there some type of fact, I guess what I'm trying to say is there a logic behind their approach to attrition and use of infantry?
Well, the Russian usage of infantry is mass, and it's good old Soviet style warfare what they are conducting. And they are not the current warfare what is happening. The Russians are actually not following their own doctrine because the battlefield reality is currently something else. Regarding foreign recruits, well, it seems to be for the Russians worth the effort to put into that in order to fill their ranks. We know that at least inside Russia, each district has a recruitment goal for a year. Last year, it was fulfilled. It was around 400,000 totally in Russia. But I think the good news or interesting news is that over the last several months, what we have observed is that the Russian losses on the battlefield are higher than the numbers they get from the recruitment. So that's an interesting moment, and we just now have to follow and see when this cumulates and this trend would continue also in the coming months, how that would impact Russian decision making regarding potential mobilization. Because let's say mobilization is probably not something what Putin would not like to do, at least forced mobilization. But if the Russians would like to escalate or to continue, then they would reach that decision point in some time in the coming months. Hard to predict what way they would go, but I think they will have to make some decisions regarding that.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I've noticed that trend as well. And so this is the part of the recruitment patterns of Russian mobilization that has gone through these different phases. And where do you think the recruitment pattern will go now? I mean, do you think that I always joke that they're going to fight this war to the last buryat, that they'll try to find every manpower possible, except to put the pressure in St. Petersburg and Moscow, because then they know that they have major problems in creating a social backlash. Do you think this is just endless for the Russians, or do you think that there is a point to where I mean, you seem to be saying that right now, that there's a certain critical juncture that they're going to reach here. But where will they go next? I mean, that's just for this manpower.
Well, what we think would happen is we probably will see more pressure on the ground put by the authorities towards people to join, use any methods available, coercion, blackmailing, methods like this, because it seems at the moment at least that the monetary tools are not bringing the numbers anymore, at least in the current situation. So we probably will see more active Russian commissariats, military commissariats on the ground. Let's say trying to get numbers from St. Petersburg and Moscow, probably we will see that. I do not predict that it will have a large impact on the population, but what would make an impact would be probably a declared or forced mobilization when the Russians would start to take people who, let's say, do not volunteer anyway, but they just start to, let's say, call people who are in the reserve lists in the mobilization system and then it would be a mandatory collab, and that would probably have an impact on the Russian society. And again, let's see when the Russians reach that point to make a, let's say, decision whether then to de-escalate in Ukraine at some point or go towards the forced mobilization.
And do you see the pushback from the regional governors inside of Russia as a factor now? Is that becoming more and more of an issue?
Well, what we see is that people are trying to fill the quota what they are given. The governors and the districts, regions have numbers issued by the MOD, and well, they are at least trying to fulfill those numbers, which at the moment at least is not as successful as it was in the past years. So, and again, it will be a very interesting discussion inside Russia then, and hard to predict then which way they would go, because the decisions at the end are made by one man,
right,
who lives in his own reality sometimes.
And do you see the shortage of manpower? How does that affected military production inside of Russia?
Well, the military industry, I would say it's not a manpower issue, probably. It is a capacity issue regarding tools and equipment and industrial machinery available. And again, this would be another topic to discuss between the Russians and North Koreans, possibly, is about North Koreans inside of Russian military industry. That's probably also something they are at least is, let's say, thinking or discussing. So I do not see the manpower issue really impacting the production. The
So
problem is somewhere else, yeah.
So what you're hitting at is bringing in North Korean laborers then to work in factories. You see that because you already saw that in Tatarstan in the Alabuga drone Shahid drone factory, where they brought in Africans to they're searching throughout Africa looking for technical expertise. It's not just bringing anybody in, but it's a very coordinated effort, almost like interviewing people for jobs where they're looking for certain skills to bring these people in and develop it. And what you're saying is that North Korea is also somewhat similar. So will that pattern, do you think, continue?
Well, I think that this area is something North Koreans could really help the Russians, because North Koreans could then dispatch, let's say, large numbers of more or less qualified workforce at once.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as we write, the income or salaries, most of it flow into the North Korean budget.
Do you think this Russian relationship with North Korea has irritated the Chinese?
No, well, I'm sure the Chinese are monitoring it very carefully, what is happening and how are the discussions and cooperation going between North Korea and Russia. But I have the feeling that the Russians and Chinese have sorted it out some way. Yeah.
Well, I wonder about that, because you don't see Chinese technicians going into Russia in the same way. Why didn't you see what happened with North Korea happen with China? In other words, why weren't the Chinese sending large amounts of ammunition and other things like the North Koreans did, and ballistic missiles? I mean, why didn't you see that? That's one of the things the interesting aspects of this relationship with Russia, that there seemed to be a limit to Chinese assistance to Russia. That's what I was kind of hinting at, and I was curious what your perspective was.
Well, I would say probably the Chinese government is more worried about, let's say, relations with the West, with the US, with the global South, being a so-called peaceful and peace-loving nation. Let's say some of activities you described would bring sanctions or secondary sanctions towards Chinese companies. And it seems that at least so far, the Chinese government has been, because of that, been hesitant to, offer open or public support or
No, I would agree with you. I think that's pretty obvious. But if they're doing it very covertly by ignoring the actions of these Chinese companies. Let me move to another topic here, and that's this sudden uh, battlefield setbacks for the Russians with Starlink. And I guess one of the questions I had for you is that, how do you stop the Russians from buying Starlink in the West? And bringing it over and putting on the Shahed drones and then building this into their networks. It's a setback for the Russians, but the Russians are very creative in how they steal things, to put it bluntly. But what is your perspective about the Starlink setbacks and the developments with that on the battlefields?
No, well, the Russians seems to use, let's say, most cheapest, most handy means of communication as the Ukrainians. I'm not aware how the Russians are able to procure Starlink. I don't know that. What are the channels and what companies are involved in that? So we haven't really investigated that.
Yeah, there's been reports in the media that in Germany that they've created networks of people going into stores and buying the Starlink, and then they're shipping it illegally back to Russia through these networks. And it must have been done quite effectively. But again, when Elon Musk shut it off and he turned the switch, he hit the kill switch, and then it seems to have had military setbacks with the Russians, and certainly in Zaporizhia. In Ukrainian operations, and they haven't quite figured out how to deal with this, other than to go back to using old-fashioned telephone lines between. I guess what I'm saying is that it's affected Russian command and control in a very, very major way, and so the lesson learned would be, how they think about fighting a war against you and against NATO and the Baltic would depend a lot on their command and control in these networks. And if they think that it's severe enough, it will affect them. And that's kind of what I was wondering, is what you thought about that.
Well, another issue what will impact or is already impacting the Russians are the shutting down of Telegram in Russia, the Telegram channel, which they are also using for C2 purposes. Again, the problem with the Russian military probably is that the centralized logistics is not so effective really, and is unable to support the troops on the ground in let's say everything except ammunition and this small high-tech gadgets and so on. Russians are also trying to use decentralized method units, finding ways to organize things for themselves through supporters in the civilian society. So that again, everything what is cheap and available and works on the battlefield, Russians are trying to use.
What do you think is going to happen with the shutdown of Telegram? I mean, will they find a solution to this? I mean, turn it back on again? I mean, what do you think will?
Well, at the end, the troops on the field then adjust somehow. Well, hopefully this all brings them into a serious disadvantage and makes them slower, less effective. And again, but let's say to Starlink, I do not see really good alternatives from any side. So, well, and we have seen the impact on the battlefield where the Russians, let's say, effectiveness has decreased seriously. So, any let's say means or measures like that we can take on our side are helping the Ukrainians absolutely.
What do you think Putin has kept Gerasimov as chief of the general staff for so long? Why? What is it about Putin and this relationship that he has with these people I mean, the battlefield results have not been that good for the Russians, but he still sticks with Gerasimov. Why do you think that is?
Well, probably several reasons. Well, first, I'm not sure the reports what Putin gets reflect, let's say, objective situation in the battlefield. really. Russian reporting system always creates, let's say, more success than it is on the ground. And then the other side is that you, well, probably in the thinking in this security services circle is that you don't let your folks down unless they betray you concretely. Ineffectiveness is not, let's say, issue to fire somebody as long he is completely loyal to you. So it seems that there is loyalty is much more important than the competence.
Why didn't it work for Shoigu?
No, well, but Shoigu didn't end up so bad. Actually, he has a, let's say, different place, and he is still alive. And well, it seems that it's a trust issue. Probably Putin completely trusts Gerasimov. And you never know when you take somebody new, you never know who that guy is and what he thinks really. And it's better to work with the cadre you have.
Do you think with Shoigu, it was all that ultimately the corruption was the issue that got to Putin that made him dismiss Shoigu?
That could be one of the reasons. It maybe got too big. And yeah, then when it's too visible, then you probably have to make some moves. But again, he survived everything. He has a decent posting and no problems. Actually, he's still around somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. This in the same way with Lavrov. I mean, I keep wondering how long Lavrov will keep lasting. But there's this
until he dies, I think.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the issue. I had in your report, you mentioned something really interesting that, and I've talked and actually been to Prague several times and talked to the Czechs. And I've become quite infatuated with the munitions, gunpowder, and artillery propellants. And your report actually has this discussion about that I've never seen before about how the Russians ran out of propellants and the cotton that they needed. And they actually had to go to, which they relied on from Central Asia, probably ever since they annexed Central Asia in the 19th century. But you wrote about this, and I found it to be really interesting. You wrote about this Novomoskovsk propellant plant. Can you talk a little bit about that? You did mention it in your report quite a bit that this was a big issue with the Russians to trying to develop their autonomous capabilities to manufacture gunpowder, which is, in a way, is kind of shocking to me.
Well, absolutely. And well, of course, our question for us is how can we, let's say, impact this industry in a negative way for the Russians. So we always try to, let's say, identify choke points, weak points, and then we can see what can we do about it. That's the question for us always.
Well, I think the Ukrainians would try to bomb it at some point or hit it with a drone, and that kind of leads me to the next question: is do you think Ukrainian drone strikes have been effective on the Russian oil industry? Because there's like 50 refineries inside of Russia, so you can't really hit every one of them, but you can hit them in the key logistical areas, like in Krasnodar province, which are very approximate to the war effort in Donbass. Do you think the Ukrainians have been effective with their drone strikes on the Russian oil industry? Have you seen a battlefield impact?
Well, I think it has to be done bit by bit anyway, and I think each strike which hits a factory has, let's say, its limited impact. But if you are able to produce effects constantly, it certainly affects the situation. But I think the oil industry, the main point targeting this is not the battlefield impact directly, but it's let's say limiting Russian incomes to the state budget. And since Russia heavily relies on the energy exports, gas and and oil exports. So any means against that sector helps, be it then kinetical strikes from the Ukrainian side or sanctions from the West, and including activities against the shadow fleet. So this everything in combination, I think, has an impact. That we have seen the Russian revenues from the, let's say, oil and gas exports heavily declining over the last years. Of course, the low oil price had its own part in this, but again, it all had an, let's say, combined effect on the on Russian state budget, which is well, having serious problems. Of course, we now have to see in the new situation in the Middle East and with the new oil prices, surely Russians will benefit from this. But we have to see how long the oil prices remain high, and it needs to be for some time in order to have a macroeconomic impact on the Russian economy. So let's see how that development then goes.
Yeah, I agree with you, because I think that the U.S. does want to get back to a low price of oil. There are elections coming, so they don't want this war to be very long. Let's turn to the Baltic and the Shadow Fleet, which you mentioned. What type of developments have been occurring with the Shadow Fleet? When I was in Estonia last year, there was the incident with the Russians providing fighter escort for one of their tankers after the Jaguar incident. What type of developments have you seen with the Shadow Fleet in the Baltic?
Well, we see that the Russians are very heavily interested in keep the Shadow Fleet going, since more than half of the Russian oil exports go through the Baltic Sea. And well, if you look at the situation, then obviously Russians are thinking about how to minimize threat to the Shadow Fleet from Baltic Sea countries. Military escorts and activities are one part of this, but maybe you have seen lately that other countries, also France, Belgium, have taken action against Shadow Fleet. Sweden, again last week. So all this, of course, helps to limit the Russian oil revenues. We know that the Russians are concerned about this, but again, it's in our interest to make our moves here.
And what about with the anchor incident last year, when the Finns actually seized a Russian ship? They took the crew. They took a very, very strong position on this. And do you think the Russians kind of learned their lessons? And were they just why were they doing that? Were they just kind of experimenting, or were they reacting, trying to provoke an incident? What was the rationale in their thinking, you think?
Well, of course, first I have to say that we have no info which connects the Russian government to these incidents, and we are more of opinion that these incidents have been really accidents. The issue is that most of the Shadow Fleet, which was not present in the Baltics before the large-scale invasion 2022, most of this fleet is badly maintained. The professional level of the seamen on board are, let's say, at lowest level. So probably that's why these things are happening. It is probably not in Russian interest to use the Shadow Fleet for any sabotage operation, because it impacts the main purpose of the Shadow Fleet, which is revenue from the oil. Of course, on the other side, we have to keep in mind that any such incident turns into a test then anyway, because the Russians obviously then observe how we react and what activities we will undertake. So obviously we have to react in a very harsh way in order to prevent, let's say, such incidents in the future, either intended or unintended incidents.
And how have you seen the development of Glen Island? I wanted to ask this question because I'm very fascinated by this island. And I'm not referring to Gotland, the Swedish island. I'm referring to Glen. And few people don't realize that Glen has been a key staging area for Russian shadow fleet operations. It's got a very strategic role in the Gulf, and not a lot of people talk about it. And I've seen reports where they put the Russians are using electronic jamming, Krasuka, electronic warfare jamming systems been put there. Can you discuss this anyway? What you've seen changes with the use of Glen?
Well, the Gotland as island, of course, on the map, it is very far in the west. If you look at the map, it's like almost maybe not the halfway from the Estonian coast, from the Russian border, but it's, let's say, very deep in our towards NATO direction. It serves as a post for different sensors, radars, electronic warfare, and so on. So Russians, it's a collection site, and it is also possible to use as a let's say jamming station because of geographical location. That's the island. It's a fully militarized island.
Can you call it a staging area? Is that a correct term to use for the Russians?
Well, it would be staging area. Well,
for shadow fleet I mean, a staging area in sense of the a kind of, I would say maybe hub. Is that right?
Well, the island as such has no facilities to support shadow fleet operations. The shadow fleet uses, of course, it passes the Gotland, but for the shadow fleet operations, the Russians have very important port facilities in the eastern part of the Finnish Bay, like Ust-Luga or Primorsk, where the shadow fleet is, docking and taking then the oil and other goods on board. Again, but from the purely military perspective, the Gotland is, let's say, serving, again, as I said, area for sensors and so on. That's the value of this island.
Thank you for addressing that. It's been one of my very big interesting areas in the Baltic. I think American policymakers and Western experts don't know enough about the islands to really to understand the geopolitical, geographical importance of them. I want to ask you about, you brought up the drones, Russian naval drones. Why? You had the July storm exercises in 2025 in the Baltic, where you saw for the first time Russian naval drones attacked a stationary object as a test, and then in August of 2025, Rubicon units attacked in the Danube, inside a Ukrainian intelligence ship inside the Danube. So you had the testing in the Baltic, and then you had the military actions actually against Romania inside the Danube. So my question for you is that, are you starting to see Rubicon or naval drone units? They say there's a regiment of naval drones in St. Petersburg. Is Rubicon playing a role with this? You mentioned it, but the Russians are way behind in naval drone warfare, but they're catching up. They're putting a great investment into it. Can you comment on that?
You are absolutely correct. The new unit in the Baltic Fleet, a regiment, has been officially established already end of last year. The units are located not only around St. Petersburg, but also in the Kaliningrad Oblast. And again, we see that the Russians are putting effort into establishing a proper capability in this field. And if they are not maybe good in this at the moment, but in a couple of years, they might be very good in this capability, because there is resources and talent and effort flowing into this.
Yeah, I think you hit a very important point about resources. I've heard that the Russians don't have the engines on the drones are not because of sanctions have affected their capabilities, and they're trying to get around that. But then again, it does seem that drones are asymmetric, and so it's a very important weapon that the Russians would use because they have this 12-1 disadvantage against NATO in the Baltic. Um, I know our time is starting to run down. You're very busy. I would like to ask a question about the Satsi boot. I alerted your staff to that. I was very curious about it. For those of our listeners that don't know about the Satsi boot, there's 115 hectares. They call it the Russian thumb, that protrudes into Estonia. And last year, a group of Russian soldiers, whether they were drunk or whether it was deliberate, crossed over into the territory, and it set off people talking about the Satsi boot. And I just do you and apparently the rules were changed where Estonians could drive across this area from one village to another. So I wasn't aware that there's actually Russian little enclaves inside of Estonia. Could you just briefly talk about that?
Yes, the Saatse boot, it's a heritage from the Soviet time where the boundaries were drawn between the so-called Estonian Socialist Republic and the Russian Socialist Republic based on villages, and then somehow they did through that boundary. And indeed, it is the situation is that along our eastern border, it cuts into the Estonian territory, but it is connected to the Russian mainland. So it's just let's say the border runs in a very weird way, and there is a road which connects different villages in the southeast, and the road runs through Russian territory, and that's the Saatse boot. And the deal between Estonia and Russia is that Estonian vehicles were allowed to cross it. Were not allowed to stop there or exit the car or something, but by driving through was okay. And well, the Russian border guard has been present in that area all the time. Maybe this time it was very visible, and the numbers which were detected were very, let's say, intense. And the reason was that the Russians did conduct an exercise along the border, Estonia-Russia, but also Estonia-Latvia. So it was a bigger exercise, and one part of it was that the Russian border guard deployed unit into the Saatse boot, which was, let's say, visually disturbing, but they did not harass anybody. The Estonian cars were able to pass through. But again, it just indicated the risk for us that since it is Russian territory, we have no control what happens inside of the boot. And the road, it's around 1 kilometer or so, which then crosses Russian territory. And if the Russians decide one day to stop a car there, then technically they can do whatever they want there because it's their territory. So in order to eliminate this risk for the Estonian people, we decided to close this road and then just build a circumvention around that area. It's just, let's say, safety measure, just to avoid any future incidents or whatever stupid ideas the Russians might come.
Yeah. Do Estonian citizens can they still drive across it in their cars?
No, we did build a fence and block the road.
Okay.
But that was our activity then from the Estonian side.
I understand. Well, listen, you've been very generous with your time. I did have a question about Rail Baltic, if you still have a moment. I don't want you to blame your Latvian colleagues on this, but I'm quite mystified by the delays in Rail Baltica, and why, with NATO mobility at stake here, they can't get these rail lines further extended. And Tartu Riga just developed a new rail line, and so you're making progress in connecting with Riga, but the Latvians aren't connecting with the rest of NATO. Can you comment on that? Just what's going on?
Well, it is difficult to comment on the Latvian situation, so you have to ask them what is going on. Estonia, from our side, we are building this full speed. throughout from Tallinn to the Latvian border. There is large construction activity going on the road. And we seriously hope then that if we then once get to the Latvian border, then there is on the Latvian side, the rails would continue. But again, it's, you have to ask the Latvians
I will. And every time I ask them, they start pointing fingers and say, well, you need to talk so-and-so. So they don't. And so my friend Ben Hodges, he's always kind of joking with them, asking what's going on. So listen, Director General Rosin, it's been a great pleasure to have you speak. You've been generous with your time. I don't want to delay you anymore. Appearing on the podcast, and it will appear as a video. We hope to have you back again at some point, and possibly about the 2027 report. I hope you're still around. But if I come to Estonia, I certainly hope to talk to you again. So thank you very much for appearing on my podcast. This is the Eyes on Eurasia podcast with Glen Howard. We're delighted that our guest today has been Kaupo Rosin, Director General of the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service. So, sir, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to talk to you. See you next time.
See you again. Bye-bye.